In 2006, a sheriff's deputy in southeastern Wisconsin radioed dispatch at 2:47 in the morning. He reported a large animal on the shoulder of Highway 11 near the Walworth County line. Dispatch asked him to describe it. He paused. Then he said something that would never appear in any official report. He said the animal was standing on two legs. He said it turned and looked directly at his patrol car. He said the eyes reflected his headlights back amber, like a dog's eyes would. Except this was not a dog. It was taller than a man. It had a long snout and pointed ears on top of its skull, and it did not run. It stood there and watched him for several seconds before dropping to all fours and vanishing into the tree line along the road. The deputy never filed a formal report. He told one person, a journalist and researcher named Linda Godfrey, who had spent the previous 15 years collecting exactly these kinds of accounts from people who had everything to lose by talking. That deputy's encounter sits in a filing cabinet alongside hundreds of others: police officers, conservation wardens, military police, park rangers, people whose entire careers depended on being credible and whose professional training made them exceptionally reliable observers. People who could tell you the difference between a timber wolf and a coyote at 200 yards in the dark, and none of them could explain what they saw. Not one. Not privately, not publicly, not after years of turning the encounter over in their minds trying to find some rational explanation that fit. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Most people who have heard of Linda Godfrey know the basics. Small-town Wisconsin journalist, found the Beast of Bray Road story in 1991, wrote a bunch of books about Dogman. But what most people don't know is what happened after the headlines faded. What happened in the years and decades that followed when she was no longer chasing a local news story, but was deep into something that fundamentally changed how she understood reality. Because Linda Godfrey didn't start her career believing in monsters. She started it believing in journalism. And by the end, after 30 years of meticulous documentation, her understanding of what Dogman might actually be had shifted so dramatically that even she struggled to reconcile where she'd ended up with where she'd begun. Today, I want to take you through that journey. Not the biography, not the timeline of her career. I want to walk you through how her thinking evolved, how the evidence she collected forced her to abandon one theory after another until she arrived at conclusions that even she found uncomfortable. And I want to show you the cases that drove those shifts, particularly the law enforcement encounters that most researchers never talk about in detail, because those cases are the backbone of Dogman research, and they change the conversation entirely. When Linda Godfrey published her first Beast of Bray Road article in December of 1991, her working theory was simple and grounded. She thought witnesses were probably seeing a large, unusual canine, maybe a wolf-dog hybrid that had gone feral, maybe an abnormally large wolf that had wandered south from northern Wisconsin where wolves were making a comeback. The descriptions sounded extreme, sure, but eyewitness testimony is unreliable. People exaggerate when they're scared. A big wolf glimpsed in headlights at night could easily become a monster in the retelling. This was the responsible position, the journalistic position. You don't jump to the extraordinary explanation when the ordinary one still fits. And for the first year or two of her investigation, she was comfortable with it. The sightings around Elkhorn could be explained by a single animal or a small group of unusually large canines working the cornfields and roadside ditches of rural Walworth County. Weird, yes. Unprecedented, maybe. But not impossible. Then the letters started coming. Not from Walworth County, from all over Wisconsin, then from Michigan, then from Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. People who had read her article in syndication or heard about it through word of mouth. People who had been carrying encounters for 5, 10, 20, sometimes 40 years without telling anyone. And the descriptions they sent were not vague. They were specific, detailed, and disturbingly consistent. The Dogman they described was not a wolf. It was not a bear standing on its hind legs. It was something that stood upright naturally, moved with confidence on two legs, had hands with fingers instead of paws, and displayed behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond any known canine. Multiple witnesses described the dogmen watching them with what they interpreted as curiosity. Not the frozen stare of a startled animal, something more deliberate, more aware. By the mid-1990s, Linda had collected enough reports to see a pattern she couldn't ignore. The consistency wasn't just in the physical descriptions, it was in the behavioral details. The dogman almost always appeared near water. Rivers, creeks, lake shores, marshland. The dogman was predominantly nocturnal, but not exclusively so. Daytime encounters happened, just less frequently. The dogman showed no fear of humans. In many cases it showed what witnesses described as open contempt or amusement. And the dogman appeared disproportionately near sites of cultural or spiritual significance, old cemeteries, abandoned churches, crossroads, and most notably ancient Native American effigy mounds. That last detail began pulling her away from the simple misidentification theory. A feral wolf dog doesn't care about burial mounds. A misidentified bear doesn't consistently appear at crossroads and sacred sites across multiple states. Something else was happening. And by the late 1990s, Linda was forced to consider explanations she never would have entertained when she first found that manila folder in the animal control officer's desk. To understand why Linda's thinking shifted, you need to understand the law enforcement cases. Not because police officers are infallible witnesses, they're not, but because their training, their observational habits, and their professional stakes make their accounts uniquely valuable. And because the sheer number of officers who contacted Linda Godfrey over 3 decades tells its own story. The deputy I mentioned at the start was far from an isolated case. Linda documented encounters from law enforcement officers across multiple states. What made these accounts distinctive wasn't just the credibility of the witnesses, it was the level of detail they provided and the behavioral patterns they described. One case that Linda referenced repeatedly in her later work involved a conservation warden in northern Wisconsin. Conservation wardens are essentially law enforcement officers who specialize in wildlife. They know animals. They know tracks. They know behavioral patterns of every species in their jurisdiction. They spend their careers in the woods and on the water identifying what's out there. They can tell you what made a track from a glance. They can identify a bird call from a quarter mile. These are people whose professional competence depends on correctly identifying wildlife. Misidentification is not something they do casually. This particular warden was conducting a nighttime patrol in a state forest during deer season. Nighttime patrols during hunting season are standard practice. Wardens watch for poachers using spotlights to jack deer. They patrol logging roads and fire lanes. They know every animal that's going to be out at that hour and in that environment. Deer, raccoons, occasionally a bear, maybe a bobcat if you're lucky. Nothing that would cause alarm. The warden observed what he initially took to be a large black bear standing near a creek bed where the logging road crossed a drainage. Bears in northern Wisconsin are common enough that the sighting wouldn't have been remarkable. He slowed his vehicle and hit the spotlight to get a better look. Standard procedure for documenting bear activity during hunting season, except the animal didn't move like a bear. As the warden watched from his vehicle with a spotlight, the animal turned toward the light and stood fully upright. The warden described the posture as natural and balanced, not the awkward rearing of a bear standing momentarily to get a better view. This was a creature that was comfortable on 2 legs. It stood approximately 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark fur. The head was unmistakably canine, with a pronounced snout, erect, pointed ears, and eyes that reflected the spotlight back with a yellow-amber glow. The warden sat in his vehicle and watched the dogman for what he estimated was 15 to 20 seconds. During that time, the dogman did not flee. It did not charge. It stood and looked at him. Then it turned, dropped to all 4s, and moved into the forest with a fluid motion the warden described as covering ground, impossibly fast for something that large. The warden did not file an official report. He contacted Linda Godfrey through a mutual acquaintance and asked that his name never be published. His reasoning was straightforward. If he filed an official report describing a 7-foot bipedal canine, his career would be over. He would be reassigned to a desk. He would lose the respect of his colleagues. He would become the punchline of every joke in the department. So he stayed silent officially and told Linda everything he'd seen. This pattern repeated across dozens of law enforcement encounters. The accounts were detailed and specific. The witnesses were trained observers who could distinguish a bear from a wolf from a dogman, and not one of them filed a formal report. The professional consequences were too severe. What made Linda's handling of these cases so effective was her methodology. She didn't just listen and write things down. She had developed a systematic interview process over the years that drew on both her journalism training and her art background. She would have the witness describe the encounter chronologically first without interruption. Then she'd go back and ask specific questions about details, the coloring of the fur, the proportions of the body, the way the dogman moved, the quality of the light, the distance between the witness and the dogman, the duration of the encounter measured not in estimates but in actions. How many steps did you take? How many breaths? What song was playing on the radio? Then she would draw. Linda was a trained artist with a degree in art education. She could translate verbal descriptions into visual renderings in real time. She would sketch while the witness talked, show them the sketch, and refine it based on their corrections. Too broad in the shoulders. The snout was longer than that. The ears were more pointed and set closer together. This iterative process produced composite images that witnesses confirmed as accurate representations of what they'd seen. The illustrations she created over 3 decades represent something unique in cryptozoological research. They're not artist interpretations based on general descriptions. They're witness-verified renderings built through a collaborative process that most police sketch artists would recognize. And when you lay those illustrations out across 30 years of cases from different states, the consistency is remarkable. The same proportions, the same posture, the same anatomical details appearing again and again in sketches made with witnesses who had never seen each other's descriptions. That visual consistency was, for Linda, some of the most compelling evidence in her entire body of work. You could dismiss written descriptions as vague or influenced by prior knowledge, but when a farmer in Ohio and a truck driver in Michigan and a park ranger in Wisconsin all independently guide an artist to produce essentially the same image of the dogman, something real is being described. Another case Linda investigated extensively involved a pair of county sheriff's deputies in Michigan who responded to a call about a disturbance near a rural cemetery. The caller reported hearing screaming sounds coming from the cemetery grounds after midnight. Not human screaming, something that sounded like a woman screaming mixed with the deep howl of a large dog. The 2 deputies arrived and swept the cemetery with flashlights and a vehicle-mounted spotlight. What they found was not a trespasser or a coyote. Near the back fence of the cemetery, partially obscured by a row of old headstones, both deputies observed a large, dark figure crouching on the ground. Their initial thought was that someone was vandalizing a grave. When the spotlight hit the figure, it stood up. Both deputies independently described the same thing: a dogman standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, dark fur, a canine head with a long snout, hands visible at its sides. The dogman didn't run immediately. It looked at both deputies. One of the officers described the sensation of making eye contact with the dogman as deeply wrong, like looking at something that understood exactly what it was seeing and was deciding whether the 2 men with guns were a threat or an amusement. The dogman turned and moved toward the tree line at the back of the cemetery. One of the deputies later told Linda it cleared a 5-foot chain-link fence without breaking stride, just stepped over it like it was a curb. Neither deputy discharged their weapons. Neither deputy filed a report that mentioned anything other than an unidentified large animal. The official log noted the response to the disturbance call and described the outcome as unfounded after a sweep of the property. Both deputies contacted Linda independently after reading one of her books. Each confirmed the other's account. Both asked to remain anonymous. Both described lingering psychological effects, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance during night shifts, a reluctance to respond to calls in rural or wooded areas after dark. One of them told Linda he had been in law enforcement for 18 years and had never been afraid on the job until that night. A third law enforcement case that Linda considered pivotal involved a state park ranger in the upper Midwest. This ranger had been responsible for a large tract of state forest and wetland for over a decade. He knew every trail, every access road, every seasonal change in the landscape. He had encountered bears, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, and every other predator native to the region at close range without incident. He was not a man who scared easily. He was not a man prone to imagining things. During a routine evening patrol of a remote section of the park, the ranger's truck headlights swept across a figure standing at the edge of a marsh. The figure was upright, tall, much taller than any person should be in the middle of a wildlife management area at dusk. The ranger stopped and reached for his spotlight. When the beam hit the figure, the ranger saw the Dogman clearly. Approximately 7 feet tall, dark brown fur covering a heavily muscled frame, a canine head with a pronounced muzzle and ears standing erect on top of the skull. The Dogman was standing at the transition between solid ground and marsh grass, positioned almost exactly at the boundary between dry land and water. What struck the ranger most was not the physical appearance, but the posture and bearing of the Dogman. It wasn't surprised by the light. It wasn't startled by the truck. It turned its head slowly toward the ranger and looked directly at him through the windshield. The ranger described the gaze as deliberate and measured. The Dogman looked at him the way a landowner looks at a trespasser, not with fear, not with aggression, with authority, with the unmistakable attitude of something that belonged there more than the ranger did. The Dogman held that gaze for several seconds. Then it turned away, not in a hurry, not fleeing, just turning, and walked on 2 legs into the marsh. The ranger watched it move through waist-high grass until the darkness swallowed it. He said the Dogman's stride was long and easy, covering ground with a smoothness that suggested this was how it normally moved. It didn't stumble. It didn't struggle with the uneven ground. It walked into the marsh like it was walking down a hallway. The ranger sat in his truck for 20 minutes before he drove away. He never reported the encounter officially. He told Linda it was the single most significant moment of his career in the outdoors, and the one thing he could never talk about publicly. He described a feeling of absolute certainty that he had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, and an equally absolute certainty that it had been watching him long before he ever saw it. These accounts illustrate something Linda considered critically important. The absence of formal documentation doesn't mean the absence of encounters. She estimated that for every law enforcement encounter she documented, there were likely 5 or 10 more that never reached her. Officers who saw something and buried it, deputies who told their partners and no one else, wardens who watched something impossible cross a logging road and decided it was easier to pretend it hadn't happened. The law enforcement cases also revealed behavioral details that didn't fit the simple predator model. The Dogman in these encounters was never attacking anyone. It wasn't hunting, it wasn't feeding. In multiple cases it appeared to be investigating something. The Dogman at the cemetery seemed to be examining the ground near graves. The Dogman the conservation warden observed was standing near a creek bed where Linda later found the area had an old indigenous fishing camp, documented in county historical records. The Dogman the highway deputy saw was standing at a stretch of road that, when Linda checked, ran within a quarter-mile of a documented Ho-Chunk effigy mound site. That geographic overlay became one of the most compelling patterns in Linda's research. She didn't discover it all at once. It accumulated over years. A sighting here near a burial mound, a sighting there near an old sacred site, an encounter at a cemetery that sat on land with documented indigenous ceremonial use. Slowly the dots connected, and the picture they formed was not the picture of a simple, undiscovered animal. The effigy mound connection deserves a closer look, because it was one of the findings that genuinely unsettled Linda Godfrey. Southern Wisconsin is home to one of the densest concentrations of ancient effigy mounds in North America. These earthworks were built by indigenous peoples between roughly 700 and 1200 AD. They take the shapes of animals: bears, birds, deer, turtles, panthers, and notably canines. Some of these mounds stretch hundreds of feet in length. They were sacred. They were connected to clan identities, spiritual practices, and relationships between the human world and the spirit world. Linda began overlaying her Dogman sighting locations with known effigy mound sites in southern Wisconsin. The correlation was striking. Sighting clusters formed around areas with dense concentrations of mounds. Individual encounters often occurred within a mile or two of documented mound sites. Some occurred directly adjacent to them. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, but too strange to explain through conventional biology. A biological animal doesn't care about thousand-year-old earthworks. A wolf-dog hybrid doesn't gravitate toward effigy mounds any more than it gravitates toward any other geographic feature. But something was pulling the Dogman toward these sites. Or something about these sites was making the Dogman more likely to appear there. Linda didn't pretend to know which explanation was correct, but the pattern forced her to consider possibilities she had once dismissed. She consulted with tribal elders and indigenous scholars. What she heard was consistent across multiple traditions. The Great Lakes tribes had long histories with beings that matched Dogman descriptions. These weren't new stories. They went back generations, centuries. The Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi all had traditions involving canine spirit beings or shapeshifters, associated with specific places, specific sacred sites, and specific spiritual functions. The tribal perspectives framed the Dogman not as a random animal, but as something connected to the land itself, a guardian, a boundary enforcer, a being tied to sacred geography in ways that Western science had no framework to understand. When Linda asked one Ho-Chunk elder why the Dogman would appear near effigy mounds, the elder's answer was simple: because that's where it belongs. It was here before us. It will be here after us. We built the mounds because we knew what lived in these places, not the other way around. That response represented a fundamental inversion of the Western scientific assumption. Science assumes the mounds are cultural artifacts and the Dogman sightings are unrelated modern folklore. The indigenous perspective says the mounds were built in response to what was already there. The Dogman came first. The sacred sites followed. Linda couldn't prove either interpretation, but the geographic correlation was real. The sighting patterns were real, and the indigenous oral traditions, maintained independently across multiple tribes for centuries, described something that matched what modern witnesses were reporting with uncomfortable precision. That convergence of evidence from completely different sources pushed her thinking into territory she'd never expected to occupy. By the early 2000s, roughly a decade into her research, Linda Godfrey had moved past the misidentification theory entirely. The evidence was too consistent across too many witnesses in too many locations for all of it to be misidentified wolves and bears. She had also largely moved past the simple undiscovered animal theory, not because it was impossible, but because the behavioral and geographic patterns didn't fit what a purely biological animal would do. This transition wasn't sudden. It happened in stages that you can trace through her published work. Her first book, The Beast of Bray Road, published in 2003, was still grounded firmly in the possibility that a real animal was responsible. She presented the sightings as a local mystery with potential biological explanations. She was careful, measured, almost cautious to a fault. She wanted to be taken seriously by the scientific community, and she knew that venturing into speculation about the supernatural would close that door permanently. Her second major work, Hunting the American Werewolf in 2006, marked the first visible shift. By then, she had collected enough reports from outside Wisconsin to recognize that whatever was happening, it wasn't local. The geographic spread alone made the simple biological theory harder to maintain. A single breeding population of unknown canines in Walworth County was one thing. The same creature appearing from Michigan to Pennsylvania to Kentucky suggested something else entirely. In that book, she began exploring the cultural and historical dimensions of the phenomenon, indigenous traditions, European folklore, the deep history of canine humanoid encounters across civilizations. By Real Wolfman in 2012, the shift was pronounced. Linda was openly grappling with the possibility that the Dogman might not be a biological animal in any conventional sense. She still presented multiple hypotheses. She still maintained her characteristic intellectual balance. But the emphasis had moved. She spent more time on the anomalous behavioral patterns, the impossible disappearances, the geographic correlations with sacred sites, and the overlap with other unexplained phenomena. The journalist who had started with a manila folder in an animal control office was now navigating territory that most scientists wouldn't acknowledge existed. Her final major works pushed even further. Monsters Among Us in 2016 and American Monsters in 2014 positioned the Dogman within a broader framework of anomalous encounters that defied easy categorization. She was no longer trying to determine what species the Dogman belonged to. She was asking more fundamental questions about the nature of perception, the boundaries of physical reality, and whether the frameworks we use to understand the natural world are adequate for everything the natural world contains. An undiscovered canine species capable of bipedal locomotion was biologically conceivable. Linda even speculated about evolutionary pressures in the Great Lakes region, the vast prairies of tall grass that once covered the Midwest, that might select for height and upright posture in a large predator. But a biological animal doesn't consistently appear at burial mounds and sacred sites. A biological animal doesn't display the kind of intelligence witnesses described, the kind of calculated, aware, almost amused intelligence that multiple witnesses noted independently. A biological animal doesn't seemingly vanish without leaving consistent physical evidence. No bones, no confirmed scat, no hair samples that held up under analysis, no clear photographs despite the explosion of trail cameras and phone cameras across rural America. The absence of physical evidence was the single biggest obstacle to the biological theory. Linda acknowledged this openly. She never tried to paper over it. If the Dogman was a flesh and blood animal, where were the remains? Where were the clear photos? Where was the physical proof that any legitimate scientific institution could examine and verify? She didn't have it. Nobody did. And that absence pushed her toward a third possibility that she initially resisted but gradually found harder to dismiss. What if the Dogman wasn't entirely physical? What if it existed in a way that didn't conform to standard biological rules? This wasn't a leap she made lightly. Linda Godfrey was a journalist. She dealt in facts, documentation, verifiable information. The idea of an interdimensional being or a spirit entity was about as far from journalism as you could get. But the evidence kept pushing her. The turning point was the accumulation of what she called impossible details. Witnesses who saw a Dogman in an open field with no cover for a quarter mile in any direction, and then the Dogman simply wasn't there anymore. Not running away, not hiding behind something. Gone. Officers who pursued a Dogman on foot and lost it in terrain where there was literally nowhere for something 7 feet tall to hide. Trail cameras that captured nothing despite being placed in active sighting areas with fresh tracks on the ground. And then there were the overlap cases. Locations where Dogman sightings occurred alongside other anomalous phenomena. Strange lights in the sky, equipment malfunctions, electronic interference, feelings of intense dread that preceded the visual sighting, as if something was present before it became visible. In a handful of cases, witnesses reported the Dogman appearing in locations that also had documented Bigfoot activity or reports of unexplained aerial phenomena. Linda was cautious about these overlaps. She knew that lumping different phenomena together was a quick way to lose credibility, but she also couldn't ignore them. If the same geographic areas produced multiple types of anomalous reports, that either meant the areas were especially prone to misperception and hoaxing, or something about those locations made them focal points for phenomena that didn't fit conventional categories. By the time she published her later books in the 2010s, Linda had settled into a position she described as deliberately open-ended. She leaned toward what she called a tangible interdimensional hypothesis. The idea that the Dogman was a real physical being in the sense that witnesses genuinely perceived it and interacted with it, but that it might not originate from or remain permanently in our physical reality as we understand it. She compared it to an animal that can move between environments, the way a seal lives in water but comes onto land. Maybe the Dogman existed in some other state or dimension or plane and could cross into ours under certain conditions, near water, near sacred sites, at certain times. She didn't claim to understand the mechanism. She simply said the evidence was more consistent with something that comes and goes than with something that lives here permanently and somehow avoids detection despite weighing several hundred pounds and standing 7 feet tall. This was not a comfortable conclusion for someone with her background. She said as much in interviews. She had started as a skeptical journalist investigating a local oddity and ended up grappling with questions about the nature of reality itself. The progression wasn't something she chose, it was something the evidence imposed on her. Let me be clear about something. Linda Godfrey never became a true believer in the uncritical sense. She never said she knew what the Dogman was. She never endorsed a single theory as the definitive answer. What she said was that after 30 years of research, the conventional explanations had too many holes. Misidentification didn't account for the consistency. An undiscovered animal didn't account for the lack of physical evidence or the impossible disappearances. Pure psychology didn't account for the trauma responses in witnesses who had never heard of the Dogman before their encounter. Each theory explained part of the picture. None of them explained all of it, and Linda was honest enough to say so rather than forcing the evidence to fit a conclusion she was more comfortable with. That intellectual honesty extended to her approach to the witnesses themselves. One of the most overlooked aspects of Linda's work was her documentation of the psychological impact on people who encountered the Dogman. She didn't just record what they saw. She recorded what the experience did to them afterward. The pattern she identified was distinct from normal wildlife encounters. When someone sees a bear in the woods, the fear response is immediate and practical. The bear is dangerous. You're afraid of being mauled. The fear makes biological sense. It's proportional to the physical threat. Dogman witnesses described something different, something Linda called a layered dread. The first layer was the normal startle response. Something large and unexpected is right there. Your adrenaline spikes, your heart hammers. That's biology doing its job. But underneath that initial shock, witnesses consistently described a second layer of fear that was harder to articulate, a sense of wrongness, a feeling that whatever they were looking at shouldn't exist. Not shouldn't as in it's dangerous, but shouldn't as in it violates the fundamental rules of the world as they understood it. The fabric of reality felt thin around the Dogman. Some witnesses described it as a feeling of being in the presence of something ancient, not just old in the way a large tree is old in a way that predated the landscape itself, a feeling that the Dogman had been there longer than the forests and the hills and the rivers, and that everything around it was temporary, but the Dogman was permanent. Others described an emotional component that didn't match any normal fear response, a profound sadness, a sense of grief almost, as if the encounter carried emotional weight that had nothing to do with personal danger. Some witnesses cried afterward and couldn't explain why. Not from fear, from something else, something they couldn't name. Linda documented this pattern across enough cases that she considered it a genuine component of the phenomenon rather than an artifact of individual psychology. Different people in different states having the same unusual emotional response to an encounter suggested the response was being triggered by something external, something about the Dogman itself, rather than generated internally by each witness's imagination. She speculated that whatever the Dogman was, it might carry some kind of energetic or psychic signature that human beings could detect unconsciously. She wasn't committed to that explanation. She floated it as a possibility consistent with the data, but she noted that indigenous traditions often described spirit beings as having exactly this kind of effect on humans, an emotional and spiritual impact that went beyond the physical, a weight that you felt in your chest and in your gut that told you something fundamental about the nature of what you were encountering. The law enforcement witnesses were particularly interesting in this regard because their training worked against them. Police officers and military personnel are conditioned to manage fear responses. They operate under stress routinely. They make decisions in high-pressure situations without being paralyzed by emotion. Yet multiple officers describe Dogman encounters as producing a fear response unlike anything in their professional experience. One retired military police officer who contacted Linda had served 2 tours in combat zones. He told her the Dogman encounter frightened him more than anything he experienced in war. Not because the Dogman was more physically dangerous than an enemy combatant, but because in war he understood what he was dealing with. The threat made sense. It fit within a comprehensible framework. The Dogman didn't. The fear wasn't about physical danger. It was about confronting something that his entire understanding of the world said was impossible. That distinction between fear of physical harm and fear of ontological disruption became central to Linda's later thinking. She believed the Dogman didn't just frighten people. It destabilized their sense of reality, and that destabilization was what made the encounters so psychologically devastating. The witnesses weren't just scared. They were unmoored. Their foundational assumptions about what could and couldn't exist had been shattered in a span of seconds. Recovering from that was far harder than recovering from a close call with a bear or a car accident. Linda also explored something that few other researchers in the field have touched: the international parallels. While her primary research focused on North America, she was aware of remarkably similar traditions from around the world, and she tracked down as many of them as she could through historical research and correspondence with researchers in other countries. The French loup-garou traditions go back centuries before Hollywood invented the silver bullet. These weren't just fairy tales. In the 16th and 17th centuries, French courts tried and convicted dozens of people for being werewolves. The trial transcripts describe encounters with canine humanoid beings in language that would not be out of place in Linda's case files. Large, upright, canine-headed, displaying intelligence and intent, appearing in rural areas near forests and waterways. The courts treated these as cases of demonic possession or witchcraft, but the physical descriptions of what witnesses and accusers reported seeing match modern Dogman accounts almost exactly. The German werewolf traditions carry similar details. The word itself, where meaning man and wolf meaning wolf, dates to Old English and Old High German, but the traditions behind the word are older still. Germanic folklore describe beings that existed at the boundary between the human world and the wild. They appeared at crossroads. They appeared in deep forests. They appeared near burial sites and places where the veil between worlds was considered thin. These were not Halloween costumes. These were serious cultural traditions that shaped how entire communities understood the landscape they lived in. The British Isles produced their own version. The black dog phantoms of English folklore, the Barghest of Yorkshire, the Black Shuck of East Anglia, the Coo Sith of Scottish Highland tradition. These spectral canine beings were associated with specific locations: churchyards, crossroads, ancient pathways, execution sites, places of death and transition. Some traditions describe them as guardians, others as omens, but the geographic associations match what Linda documented in North America with eerie precision. Sacred sites, liminal spaces, boundaries between one kind of landscape and another. Even further afield, the cynocephaly of medieval European literature described dog-headed humanoid beings encountered by travelers in distant lands. These accounts appeared in the writings of respected scholars and explorers. Marco Polo mentioned them. St. Augustine discussed whether they possessed souls. Medieval mapmakers placed them at the edges of the known world, in the territories where civilization gave way to wilderness. The conventional interpretation is that these were fantastical inventions or misinterpretations of encounters with unfamiliar peoples, but the specific detail of a dog-headed humanoid appearing repeatedly across centuries of independent accounts from different cultures raises the same question Linda's American research raised. Is everyone imagining the same thing independently? Or are they describing something they actually encountered? The global distribution of canine humanoid traditions was something Linda considered deeply significant. These traditions arose independently in cultures separated by oceans and centuries. The indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region had no contact with medieval European monks writing about cynocephaly. The Navajo had no exposure to French werewolf folklore. Yet the descriptions showed common themes: canine-headed beings, association with specific sacred or liminal locations, appearance at transitional times, dusk, dawn, the turning of seasons, behavioral intelligence suggesting something beyond animal cognition, and that same layered dread that modern American witnesses described. Either human beings across every culture independently invented the same imaginary creature with the same behavioral characteristics and the same geographic associations, or they were describing something real that manifested across the globe. Linda leaned toward the latter possibility, while acknowledging the former couldn't be entirely ruled out. The human mind does have common features across cultures, archetypes, shared fears rooted in evolutionary psychology. It's possible that every culture invents the wolfman for the same psychological reasons. But when you combine the cultural traditions with the modern eyewitness reports, with the law enforcement encounters, with the geographic patterns around sacred sites, with the consistent psychological impact on witnesses, the purely psychological explanation starts to strain. Too many independent lines of evidence point in the same direction for all of them to be projection and imagination. Linda's final published works reflected a researcher who had traveled an enormous intellectual distance. From skeptical journalist to cryptozoological investigator to someone grappling with questions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and what exists beyond the borders of mainstream scientific understanding. She never lost her journalist's rigor. She still documented carefully. She still verified when possible. She still asked hard questions. But she allowed herself to entertain possibilities she never would have considered in 1991. The possibility that the Dogman was not a creature in the biological sense, but a presence, something woven into the landscape itself, something connected to sacred geography and ancient spiritual traditions, something that could make itself known to humans when it chose to, and disappear when it didn't, something that had been here longer than recorded history, and had no intention of revealing itself on terms other than its own. She was also honest about the toll the research took on her. 3 decades of listening to frightened people describe impossible things. 3 decades of being dismissed by mainstream science and mocked by skeptics who hadn't read her work and had no interest in the evidence she'd compiled. 3 decades of carrying the weight of hundreds of encounters that she could document but never definitively explain. It wore on her. She didn't complain about it publicly, but people close to her acknowledged that the work was isolating. Being the world's foremost authority on something that most of the world considers a joke is a lonely position. The correspondence alone would have overwhelmed most researchers. Linda maintained active communication with witnesses across the country for decades. Some of these relationships lasted years. A witness would contact her after an initial encounter, and Linda would stay in touch as they processed the experience. Follow-up emails, phone calls, checking in months or years later to see how the witness was coping. She understood that for many of these people, the encounter was not a single event, but an ongoing psychological process. The initial shock faded, but the questions didn't. What did I see? Am I safe? Will it come back? Does this mean everything I believed about the world is wrong? Linda couldn't answer most of those questions, but she could be present, she could listen, she could share what other witnesses had experienced and help people understand that their reactions were normal within the context of something profoundly abnormal. That ongoing support was as much a part of her legacy as the books and television appearances. She also maintained what amounted to an informal network of repeat witnesses and long-term observers, people who lived in areas with recurrent Dogman activity and who agreed to document what they saw or heard over months and years. These long-term observation reports gave Linda something that one-time encounter accounts couldn't provide: patterns over time, seasonal variations, changes in activity levels, responses to environmental changes like construction, logging, or shifts in land use near sighting locations. The data was imperfect, collected by civilians without scientific training, but it added depth and texture to the broader picture in ways that individual encounter reports couldn't. What sustained her through all of it was the witnesses. The emails at 3 a.m. from someone who just saw something on a back road and needed to tell someone before they convinced themselves it hadn't happened. The letters from elderly people who had carried an encounter for 50 years and were finally ready to share it before they died. The phone calls from police officers who needed to hear that they weren't losing their minds. Linda gave those people something invaluable. She gave them belief, not blind belief. Not gullible acceptance of every claim, but the willingness to listen without judgment, to take their accounts seriously, and to tell them they weren't alone. For many witnesses, that simple act of being believed was more important than any theory about what the Dogman actually was. When Parkinson's disease began limiting her ability to work in her final years, the flow of reports didn't stop. People were still seeing the Dogman, still encountering something in the forests and along the rural roads that didn't fit into any category their worldview provided for. The phenomenon outlived the researcher, and that itself was a kind of evidence. If the Dogman sightings had dried up after Linda stopped actively investigating, you could argue the phenomenon was somehow dependent on her. But the reports continued unabated. Whatever people are seeing, it exists independently of anyone documenting it. So where does all of this leave us? 30 years of the most dedicated Dogman research ever conducted by the most credible researcher the field has produced. And the conclusion is an uncomfortable one. We don't know. Linda Godfrey didn't know, and she was closer to the evidence than anyone. What we do know is this. Hundreds of credible witnesses across multiple states and decades have described the same thing. The Dogman is consistent in physical description, consistent in behavior, consistent in the types of locations where it appears, and consistent in the psychological impact it has on the people who see it. That consistency across independent witnesses is the strongest evidence we have that something real is being observed. We know that the law enforcement cases add a layer of credibility that's difficult to dismiss. Trained observers with professional incentives to be accurate, operating under conditions where they know exactly what the local wildlife looks like, are describing something that doesn't match any known animal, and they're doing it at the cost of their own comfort and peace of mind. We know that the geographic patterns, particularly the correlation with ancient sacred sites, suggest a connection to the land itself that goes beyond what a simple biological animal would produce. And we know that indigenous traditions spanning centuries describe the same being with the same characteristics and the same associations. We know that the psychological impact on witnesses is distinctive and consistent. The layered dread, the sense of wrongness, the ontological disruption. These responses don't match normal wildlife encounters. They suggest the Dogman, whatever it is, affects human beings on a level that goes beyond simple physical fear. And we know that Linda Godfrey's intellectual journey from skeptic to reluctant explorer of the impossible was not driven by belief or desire or attention-seeking. It was driven by evidence that accumulated over decades until the conventional explanations simply couldn't hold it all. She didn't want to end up where she ended up. The data took her there. She left behind a body of work that represents the most thorough documentation of this phenomenon ever assembled. Her books, her case files, her correspondence with hundreds of witnesses, her maps and geographic overlays, her carefully maintained database of encounters. All of it built on the foundation of one simple principle. Listen to people. Document what they say. Look for patterns. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. That's what she did. And what it revealed is that the Dogman is not what most people think. It's not a misidentified wolf. It's not a Hollywood werewolf. It's not a simple undiscovered species hiding in the woods. It's something more complex, more ancient, and more deeply connected to the land and to human spiritual history than any of those explanations can accommodate. Linda Godfrey showed us that. She showed us through 3 decades of work that most people wouldn't have had the courage or the patience to do, and she showed us with an intellectual honesty that the field desperately needed. She said what she found. She said what she didn't know, and she left the rest for those of us who continue to investigate. The Dogman is still out there. People are still seeing it. The reports still come in. The descriptions are still consistent. The encounters still leave witnesses shaken and changed in ways that don't fade with time. Whatever this is, it isn't going away. It isn't being explained, and it isn't waiting for science to catch up. Linda Godfrey spent 30 years trying to understand it. She got closer than anyone, and the most important thing she showed us is that the question itself, what is the Dogman, might be the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, what does it mean that the Dogman exists in the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to accept? What does it mean that ancient cultures recognized it and modern science ignores it? What does it mean that trained observers see it and then stay silent because the truth is too dangerous to their careers? Those questions don't have easy answers. Linda knew that. She lived with that uncertainty for 3 decades and turned it into the most significant body of Dogman research ever produced. The rest of us are still catching up. What she showed us, more than any single theory or any single case, is that the phenomenon is real even if we can't yet define what the phenomenon is. Something is interacting with human beings in the forests and along the rural roads of North America. Something consistent, something intelligent, something connected to the land in ways we don't understand. Something ancient that was here before us and will almost certainly be here after us. The temptation is to put it in a box, call it a cryptid and hand it to biology. Call it a spirit and hand it to theology. Call it a delusion and hand it to psychology. Linda resisted every one of those reductions because none of them fit the full picture. The Dogman moves between categories the way witnesses say it moves between the shadows. You think you've pinned it down, and then the next piece of evidence pulls the floor out from under your certainty. That ambiguity is uncomfortable. Human beings want answers. We want categories. We want to know what something is so we can decide whether to fear it, study it, or ignore it. The Dogman refuses to cooperate with that impulse. It has been refusing for centuries, if the historical and indigenous records are any guide, and it shows no sign of becoming more accommodating anytime soon. If you've had an encounter yourself, know that you're not alone. Hundreds of people before you have seen the same thing, and thanks to the work Linda Godfrey did, there's a place for your experience in a larger picture that's still coming into focus. For more stories like this, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. And pay attention to the spaces at the edges of the road where the headlights don't quite reach. Something is watching. Something that's been watching for a very long time. And Linda Godfrey spent her life making sure we understood that. For more interesting videos, check this out.